Now, this lecture is not recorded. I've been asked that.
Okay, we're live streaming, so I will be happy to delete the recording after the fact.
Oh, you don't have to, from my point. I'm just saying some people who couldn't come said, is it going to be recorded? And I said, I don't know.
Yes, it is. As long as that works for you, we're happy to record.
Now, this lecture is not recorded.
Oh.
Someone said it's not recorded. So
sorry, several pieces of technology going at the same time, and I was listening to myself while I was listening to you, listening to myself. All right, so it is officially 7 o'clock. So I will go ahead and get things started here, and then we will turn it over to Dr. Heineman. We're just going to be letting a few folks in Zoom as we have Dr. Heineman here with us. So welcome everyone on Zoom, on YouTube, and here in the room. We've got all of the technology going all at once. We are so thrilled to have you for tonight's lifelong learning lecture featuring Dr. Helen Heineman. She will be talking about, excuse me, the world's greatest diarists. So if you are curious about the thoughts of the folks behind some of the greatest literature, she's going to give us a little bit of an insight into what they were thinking when they were doing their best writing. A few quick announcements before we get started. For those of you in the room, excuse me, please go ahead and silence your cell phones so that they don't go off part of the way through the lecture. And then for those of you in the room, we have some paper evaluation forms on the back table. We would love to hear from you what you thought about today's event. If you have any ideas for future events, or if you have if you'd like to join our mailing list, we would love to have you there. Folks on Zoom, I will be putting the link to the online evaluation form in the chat at the end of the discussion. So we will go ahead and we would love to hear from you there as well. This program is in partnership with Framingham State University, and a huge thanks to our sponsors, the Joseph L. Frund Foundation, courtesy of Liz Fideler, and of course the Framingham Public Library, friends of the library, without whom none of these events are possible. We would love to invite you to some of our upcoming events as well. We have a lecture every Thursday at 7 p.m. in November. So we would love to have you for all of those. And then all of those will be only on Zoom or in person. So today's lecture is just a special occasion having it, on YouTube and in person. Today's lecture on Zoom is a special occasion. So most of the time our lectures take place on YouTube Live, and then on here, here in the room. We'd love to have you come in person because we do have coffee, cookies, and other refreshments. So with that, we would like to welcome Dr. Heineman. Thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about the diary tonight as a literary form. It's began spontaneously, of course, used by everyday people. And I guess you could say their motivation was somehow to make life stop for a few minutes and think about it in writing. Sometimes diaries begin because someone is writing them in response to some particular major event. Some writers, when they traveled, they wrote diaries, and they turned those diaries into books. Dickens did that. Anthony Trollope did it. Mrs. Trollope did it. There's a wide range of personal writing, and some authors are famous writers. Some writers of diaries are people who live in the public eye. Others were completely unknown. Leonardo da Vinci, I'm going to begin there in the 16th century. He filled his diaries with the workings of his incredibly fertile mind. He filled his diaries with his own sketches. That's another thing you can do in a diary. You can draw, and he certainly did. Anne Frank used her diary to to fill time while she was hiding from the Nazis during World War II. Dickens kept a secret diary, recording in code his trips to see Ellen Ternan, who was his mistress in the last 15 years or so of his life. He also kept a diary of his interviews with prostitutes when he was working on Urania House, a charitable effort that he made to try to help women throw off that past and find new lives. Unfortunately, those diaries, someone got rid of them. We don't know where they are. Oscar Wilde kept a diary, and being Oscar Wilde, he joked about it. He said, "I never travel without my diary. One should always have something sensational to read when riding on the train." So that's my introduction, and I'm going to begin, as I say, in the 15th century with the diaries of a genius. It's always important and interesting to look at the diaries of a genius. Leonardo da Vinci, certainly one of the greatest artists of all time and a multi-talented genius. And when he died, he left behind him certain great paintings. The first one, of course, everybody knows, the Mona Lisa, which is a seemingly ordinary portrait of a young woman, but with a certain perplexing smile. And people really can't figure it out. It seems to be a kind of magnet that draws people to it. He also did another equally famous painting that we all probably have either seen a reproduction of or perhaps have been lucky enough to see it in person. It's on the wall of a church, and it's his famous Last Supper painting, which gives the reaction of all the different apostles to the Last Supper with Jesus. He also left 6,000 pages of diary entries containing observations, discoveries, ideas from physics, from architecture, from engineering, to anatomy and botany. And these 6,000 pages, we're told by critics, probably represent a fifth of how much he actually produced. Some of the pages have been bound into volumes, and I'd like you to just look at a couple of the pages with me. He kept these so-called, this is a relatively simple page, but you can see that he wrote from right to left. It's been called mirror writing. We don't know why he did this. It may have been because he wanted to be private and stop others from reading, but we don't know. But anyway, his diary is quite a task to read it because it's from right to left. He understood anatomy, and he was learning about anatomy. He actually participated in the dissection of corpses so that he would learn how the muscles and the bones move. And in the next picture of a page of his diary, you see he draws a picture in the middle of the diary of a baby and how it grows in the uterus. His diary pages are quite valuable, as you can know. They've all been disengaged and sold to various museums, and so we don't ever have exactly what he kept, but we have the pages. Now, moving from that's an example of a diary in the 15th century, and we move to a very different kind of diarist, a man named Samuel Pepys. He was a naval administrator. He was the son of a tailor, and he made a marriage of love in 1655 to a 15-year-old girl who was a Huguenot exile, Elizabeth Saint-Michel. And his diaries are very, very interesting. He rose to be an administrator on the naval board. Nobody knows why he chose to begin a diary, but it's clear that he was writing for his eyes alone. He wrote about the daily work in the naval office. He wrote about his leisure. He wrote about his household. He wrote about his finances. He wrote about his worries. And most interesting of all, he wrote about his pleasures, and most particularly detailed descriptions of his sexual life. He wrote on one page in 1666, when he was in his 30s, "The truth is, I do indulge myself in pleasure, knowing that this is the proper age of my life to do it." It's one of our greatest historical records, and it is a major work of English literature. He was witness to a lot of very important historical events: the coronation of King Charles II, the Great Plague of 1665, and the Great Fire of 1666. Originally, he wrote in a very cryptic shorthand. I think we have a page of his diary. It took a lot for people to understand his shorthand, but it has been understood and put together. And it was first printed in 1825, and the Edinburgh Review, which reviewed it, said, "We would never wish it a page shorter. It is so entertaining to be transported into the very heart of a time so long gone by, and to be admitted to the public counsels of a man of great activity." He's got one page, a very interesting page, where he reports one of his bouts of public sexual intercourse with his mistress. He loved his wife, but he had a mistress, and he had a lot of assignations. And he wrote, this is one of those entries: "I got her to go with me and meet me at the wine house, where I did give her a lobster and had intercourse and felt her all over, making her believe how fair and good a skin she had. She had a very white thigh and leg, but she was monstrous fat." Think of that detail. So despite his infidelity, he did love his wife. In fact, he was insanely jealous of her. He didn't want her to have any relations with anyone else. But it may have been that she had some gynecological problems, which may have stopped her from enjoying her pleasures with Pepys. And he perhaps sought carnal gratification away from home. If we look at that diary again, you see he had to write out certain, like he had lamb, monk, lamb. He didn't have a word for that, but he has a wonderful, the diary is just wonderful. When he was watching the Great Fire of London, he wrote, "I went down to the waterside. I got a boat and saw a lamentable fire. Everyone was endeavoring to remove their goods. Poor people stayed in their houses as long as they could until the fire touched them, and then they ran for the boats. The poor pigeons were loath to leave their houses, but hovered about the balconies until some of them burned their wings and fell down." That's a wonderful piece of detail about the Great Fire. By the end of 1669, he stopped writing in his diary. He believed that the strain of writing was making him go blind, but he didn't. Anyway, after his death in 1703, his diary was forgotten until 100 years later. It was transcribed, and it wasn't published until 1970. It is probably the most famous diary in English, and it's worth taking a look at. Moving to the 18th century, we meet our next diarist, James Boswell. Boswell is known mainly because he wrote the life of Samuel Johnson. It's one of the greatest biographies in the English language. It's wonderful. They contain unique descriptions of 18th century life. Soldiers, aristocrats, politicians, storekeepers, prostitutes, laborers. He wrote about many encounters with London prostitutes, actually, together with his feeling of guilt about his profligacy. His diaries describe his first meeting with Samuel Johnson, his passionate affair with an actress, his discovery that he had caught gonorrhea. That's all in the diaries. He was always writing about how he should behave and resolving to do better the next day. And yet he wrote in November in one entry, "In the midst of divine service, I was laying plans for having a woman." So, even his sort of secret thought that he was somewhat ashamed of, that he was thinking of this while he was at church, he puts in the diary. And he said, but he became a friend of Johnson, who was perhaps the greatest writer of the 18th century. And he said, "I'm going to write down everything I remember of his conversation." Johnson was a great conversationalist. And using his diary, he wrote probably the greatest diary in English. And we have a picture, I think, of his diary also, of Boswell's diary. Okay, can we have that page of the Boswell diary? All right. Well, you take my word for it. It's a good diary. The next diary that I want to talk about is one that brings me into my familiar ground of the 19th century, the diary of Dorothy Wordsworth, the sister of William Wordsworth. She is unique among all of these because she didn't write anything else except her diary. She didn't write poetry, she didn't write plays, she didn't write a biography. She only wrote her diary. And she dies in 1803, so she just makes it into the 19th century. She was very close to her brother William, as you already perhaps know. She lived with him for most of her life, and her diaries are not published until after her death. What's interesting to the reader of her diaries is that they show us the inspiration behind many of her brother's poems. The famous Daffodils poem. He didn't have very good eyesight. William did not have good eyesight, and she was his eyes, and she wrote all the detail of how the daffodils looked beside the lake and so forth. And years later, when he looked at her diaries, he read it, and it inspired him to write one of the greatest poems in English, the so-called Daffodils poem, beginning, "I wandered lonely as a cloud." She had a great talent for description. She had a great memory for detail. She recorded everything. William was a great walker. She was always by his side, and she would write things down. He didn't write down at the time he was walking. He would write later. Anyway, this is an instance of a diary used by someone else for the creation of great literature. I think it's the only example that I know of such an amazing thing. And I think we have a page of her diary, the next one. This is an interesting page because somebody crossed something out. And what she had put in those passages that were crossed out, and we figured it out, on the night before William was going to be married, he gave her the wedding ring he was going to give to his future bride, whom he loved, and she wore it all night before she returned it to him in the morning. It's a kind of a strange detail, but she put it down, but somebody else tried to cross it out, and because we have ingenious readers, we know what was in the passage. Many people suggested that William and Dorothy were intimate. They were not. It's just that she knew she was losing him to Mary, his wife to be, and she wore that wedding ring that night and wrote about it in her diary. Okay, our next diarist, 19th century diarist, is Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria kept a daily journal. She began it when she was 13, so it's great. We have an early diary writer, and she continued it with just a few breaks to the end of her life. It consists of 13 volumes. I have some of them. A librarian friend of mine, they were getting rid of certain volumes, and they were going to throw, I don't know what they do with them, but she said, "Do you want them?" I said, "Yes." So I had some of those 13 volumes. And not only 13 volumes, but there are 111 volumes that were transcribed by her daughter, Beatrice. Beatrice cut many pages out. Victoria was very frank in her diary about her relationship with Prince Albert. They adored one another. And Beatrice must have thought that these things were too intimate, and so she simply cut them out. But despite her cuts, we can see in them her love for Albert, a lot of details of the births of her children. She hated her pregnancies, and she had, 10 children? I mean, she went through 10 pregnancies. Her coronation thoughts, a lot about her grief at the time of Albert's death. In one of her entries, she wrote, quote, "I never spent such an evening. My dearest, 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 dear Albert, his excessive love and affection gave me feelings of heavenly love and happiness. I never could have hoped to have felt like this before. He clasped me in his arms, and we kissed each other again and again. his beauty, his sweetness, his gentleness. How can I ever be thankful enough to have such a husband, to be called by names of tenderness I have never yet heard used to me before? It was bliss beyond belief. Oh, this was the happiest day of my life. Isn't that great? Anyway, in the year 2012, the entire series of Victoria's diaries were made available online. You can get it. And we have a picture of her diary, I believe. This is a very neat diary. She was a very neat woman. Her later diaries also contain sketches. Our next diarist is Charlotte Bronte, the author of Jane Eyre. She kept a journal when she got her first teaching job at Roe Head School. And she wrote in tiny, very clear but tiny letters on small sheets of paper, which she folded in four. So each page was 4.5 by 7 inches. She and her siblings had made miniature books like this when they were young and filled them with stories about imaginary worlds. This is Roe Head School. That's Charlotte's own pencil drawing of the school she worked in. It's called the Roe Head Journal, and she wrote her daily life, and it's quite bleak. She describes the extreme local weather, her loneliness, the struggle she had to adjust to life as a teacher. She really didn't want to be a teacher. She wanted to be a writer. And the diary for her was a form of escape from the tedium of her daily teaching life. And subsequently, of course, she used details from it in her novels. In fact, the early sections of Jane Eyre, which are beautifully written, a lot of them come from the Roe Head journals. In one entry, she wrote, "Must I from day to day sit chained to this chair, prisoned within these four walls? I am going to write instead because I can't help it." So she describes what she is doing, and her handwriting, I believe I have a slide of that in the next. Her handwriting is so small that most people really need a magnifying glass in order to read it. Do we have that one? I don't know if I put it in or not. Anyway, and her sister Emily also kept a diary, and we do have, I think, a picture of Emily's diary. Here's Emily's diary. Look at that. Teeny tiny writing, and in the middle, that sketch of herself and her sister sitting at the table in the evening and writing their novels. It's a picture of a moment of creativity. We wouldn't have known how it looked without this diary. She kept it for 4 years, and this page, as I show you, shows two sisters at work. Spread on the table are the small sheets of paper on which they wrote their stories. And I think we have, I don't know if I have another one or not of this, but you can sometimes at libraries and museums will show you these small books. They were, after her death, her husband kept them. And after he died, his second wife eventually sold them up to, of all places, the University of Texas, which is where they reside. Okay, well, the next use of a diary is a very unusual one, and I call it the role of diaries in marriage. This is a picture of Robert and Clara Schumann. When they married in September 1840, they decided to write a joint marriage diary. Robert wrote, "I want to record all the joys and sorrows of marital life." She was a famous concert pianist. He, of course, a very famous composer. And they had to fight for the right to marry because her father thought Robert was a wastrel and that this marriage would ruin his daughter's musical career. They agreed what they would do is write on alternate weeks. He would write this week, she would write the next week. Although Clara probably wrote more pages than Robert. He is rather pedantic. She is chatty. They describe their busy life, their friends, their concerts, their performances. Their income came mainly from her performances. She also ran the home. She looked after the children. They had 8 children. And he wrote famous music, and she was a famous pianist. The last section, the overall impression of this diary is of a loving and harmonious marriage. The last section covers a concert tour she made in Russia in 1844, and Robert went with her. And their return from Russia marks the end of their diary. Alas, around that period of time, Robert descended into, I guess you do have to call it madness. He attempted to commit suicide and eventually died in an asylum. She outlived him by 40 years, but she never remarried, although she had a very close relationship with Brahms after her husband's death. Here's an early entry from that marriage diary, and I think we have it. First, let me kiss you most tenderly on this day, your first day as a wife, the first of your 22nd year. So we know how old she was when she got married. This little book, which I inaugurate today, has a very intimate meaning. It shall be a diary about everything that touches us mutually in our household and in our marriage, our wishes, our hopes, also a little book of requests that we might make toward each other. It's also about mediation and reconciliation whenever we might have a misunderstanding. In short, our diary shall be our good, true friend to whom we entrust everything and to whom we open our hearts. It's a beautiful picture of their marriage. We have another famous marital diary, and that is the diary of Leo Tolstoy, born in 1828, living to 1910, and his wife. And we have a picture, it's a painting of the two of them. There are their books on the table, their teacup, and this is, of course, in later life. They married when he was 34 and she was barely 18. The marriage lasted 48 years and was full of love and happiness, although also pain and resentment. It is one of the most famous marriages of a great literary figure because he and his wife both were exceptional people, and they each set down a remarkable portion of their married lives in these diaries. Generally, I think the diary, and there's a whole book on it. I mean, I think I gave a lecture at one point on their marriage. And generally, it was a rich marriage. The first 20 years, very joyful, marked by the arrival of many children, the publication of War and Peace and Anna Karenina. All those manuscripts she transcribed every night, tirelessly. She was his amanuensis. But in the 1880s, he became depressed. And although these later years were sporadically happy, they were marred by one of his malevolent disciples and by one of their daughters, a very ill-intentioned daughter who came between them. Tolstoy kept diaries for most of his adult life. He began when he was 18. He was confined to the hospital because he had venereal disease. So he was in the hospital with nothing to do. So he began, and he said he wanted to keep a diary. He wanted to make reflections on the purpose of life and the aim of self-improvement. This is a very different kind of a diary. It's a diary of a very great writer. I mean, a genius, let's face it, Tolstoy. He wrote of himself in his diary, "I am intemperate, indecisive, inconstant, stupidly conceited, and ardent. I accuse myself of cowardice, impracticality, and idleness." Man who wrote all these books. He divided each page of his diary into 2 columns. In the first column, he would set the targets for each day. And then he would record on this other part, the other second half of the page, whatever he achieved in that day. He didn't keep that up too long. That would be a very hard thing to do. Later, he simply wrote out his thoughts and his opinions on a huge range of topics: social problems in Russia, rural life, industrialization, education, and above all, spiritual questions. He showed great concern for the lower classes, and in his later life, he began to believe that he should give his wealth away. And this came between him and his wife. I mean, she had something like 13 children. And she said, no, we can't give the money. We've got all these children. We've got an estate. And he wanted to give everything away. He wanted to become a pure Christian. Another thing that happened to them as a result of their diaries is when he first married her, and again, remember, he's 34 and she's 18. He had written all about his life beforehand, his visits of prostitutes, his venereal disease, and so forth, and particularly about a love affair he had with one of the peasants on his estate. I think we can see a page of his diary. He decided that before he married her, he wanted her to read his diary. Big mistake. She was shocked, especially the frank descriptions of her husband's love life and the fact that he had fathered a son from this peasant woman, and that they lived on the estate, the woman and the child. Think about how hard that would be for anyone to accept. Eventually, she accepted it. And it is true that throughout his long marriage to her, he remained totally faithful to her, never deviated from his faithful love for her. She ran the home, she ran the estate, she bore him 13 children. She made fair copies of all his manuscript drafts. She did editing. I mean, she did everything for him. But she also kept a diary all through her married life. And at first, it's an idyllic picture of life at the country estate, picnics, dinner parties, meeting with famous writers like Chekhov. But as he became more obsessed with his religious views and the fact that he wanted to live this pure Christianity and give everything away, she felt alienated. And her diary at the end is a very poignant record of their deteriorating relationship, ending in 1910 when the 82-year-old Tolstoy ran away from her, took a train to this train station, and he was dying, and the daughters went there and they forbade the mother to go in and see him. He died in the train station. It was a kind of sad ending to what had been a wonderful life. Her diaries give insight into how he used his life with her in his writings. In Anna Karenina, for example, there's a wonderful passage of the wedding of Levin and Kitty. And she writes in her diary, Lev Nikolaevich described our marriage ceremony perfectly in his novel Anna Karenina when he described the wedding of Levin and Kitty. So she knew this. And she recalled at this time, Lev is very sweet and seems to be happy. When they left after their marriage and they got in the carriage and went off, this is the first time she's going to consummate with this man. She writes in her diary, the horses made impatient noises. Lev slammed the doors of the carriage. I hid myself in the corner and wept without stopping because he had given her his diary to read. And he worried after that in his own diary that reading his diary had destroyed some, if not all, of his love for her love for him. He wrote in his diary 2 days after his marriage, she knows everything now. It is simple. She writes on that day, I was so shy and I was afraid. They made an agreement to read each other's diaries. This was a mistake, in my judgment. But anyway, they made that agreement. They said they would hide nothing. One of his entries, he writes, unbelievable happiness. I love her as much as ever, if not more. She's charming. I love her. And her overwhelming love for him made her vulnerable to jealousy. She wished she had been his first love. She was not his first love. And of course, she was certainly his last love. She wrote in her diary, "He kisses me, but I say to myself, I am not the first one to captivate him." If she had not read the diary, she probably would have accepted the fact that there must have been women before her. I mean, he was 34, she was 18. The diaries gave her too vivid a sense, because he was a great writer, of his earlier affairs, particularly his relationship with the peasant woman Axinia, who still lived on the estate with her child. She wrote in her diary, Sophie, "I caught a glimpse today of Axinia. She is very beautiful." Well, the slightest coolness that he would have toward her frightened her. In one entry, she writes, "He does not love me. It's terrible." He writes, "We've had 2 clashes at home. I was rude. Still, I love her more and more. My happiness with her takes my breath away." But, she was totally absorbed in her marriage while he had his literary career and his duties as manager of the estate. And she wrote in her diary, "He is happy because he is clever and talented, but I am neither clever or talented. One cannot spend one's life on love alone, but I am so limited that for the time being, I think only of him." It's really quite insightful about the position of women at the time, and particularly her position in her marriage. But their happiness grew and remained. He wrote in his diary, "Family happiness absorbs me so entirely that sometimes it is not possible to work. I love her at night or in the morning when I get up and see her. She looks at me and she loves me. I love her when we are alone and I say, what are we to do now? I love her even when she becomes angry and she smiles shyly at me." 7 months later in the diary, he writes, "I love her more and more. I feel a sense of annihilation in front of her. She is so good and pure and whole. In these moments, I feel I cannot possess her in spite of the fact that she has given everything to me. I am not worthy of her." They're just fascinating to read. She copied those last words that I read to you. She copied them out after she read them in his diary, and she carried them with her always. He was with her throughout her first pregnancy and from all of them, all 13 of them. And he is the first novelist who describes the birth of children, no doubt thanks to Sonia's diary entries and his own presence. In the first 20 years of her marriage, she made fair copies of all her husband's work. Once she said she copied War and Peace 7 times with pages and pages of incidents and chapters. Anyway, I have to go ahead a little bit, but she made a great contribution. Tolstoy gives us great female characters. Dostoevsky, also a very great novelist, but he can't match Tolstoy in his portrayal of women. The close relationship with Sonia and the diaries, perhaps, enabled him to get inside the skin of his heroines. At any rate, I have to stop here because I could give the whole lecture on their marriage and their diaries. The next diarist we're going to talk about briefly is Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf started keeping a diary at the age of 14. And by that time, she was already emotionally scarred by the sexual abuses of one of her half-brothers. Her diaries, and we can see here a page of them, they developed in parallel to her career as a writer. They were really for her a training ground for writing fiction and a kind of literary exercise. She kept a daily diary. She said she liked to write in her diary because in a diary she could write at, quote, "a rapid, haphazard gallop with slapdash and vigor." She always regarded her diaries as possible raw material for her future work. She once tried to describe her diary. She said, "What sort of diary should I like mine to be? Something loose knit and yet not so slovenly and elastic that it will embrace everything that comes into my mind. I should like it to resemble some deep old desk in which one flings a mass of odds and ends without looking them through." That's a beautiful description. The diary is a deep old desk into which you throw everything without looking at them and, sorting it out. You just throw it in there. In another entry, she discussed further the value of keeping a diary. She says, "It loosens the ligaments. Never mind the misses and the stumbles." And she, as she wrote in it and sort of thought about her own progress as a writer, she said that her writing became easier because of this daily writing exercise. Of course, we know, unfortunately, she had episodes of depression and madness, several suicide attempts, and the last one, of course, was successful. Her husband, Leonard Woolf, in 1953, published extracts from her diary. And the slide, I think, shows that. He published passages he considered relevant to her life as an author. This is the diary, but show those publications. He put those Diary of Virginia Woolf, a writer's diary, but he wouldn't put the personal parts out. He said they are too personal to be published as a whole. So we don't get her everything. Leonard excised it. Our next diarist is Van Gogh, who I'm calling his letters to his brother a kind of diary. This is one of the pages of his letters. Look at that. He always would put in his diaries sketches. And so the letters to Theo, I think really, and they've been collected and they're a great read. They are a kind of diary. And then again, one of the most famous diarists ever was Anne Frank. Here she is. Her diary was kept from 1942 to 1944. It was given to her on her 13th birthday. A few weeks later in the diary, she writes that her sister was called up for deportation and her father planned to take the family into hiding. She describes stuffing her diary into a satchel. Quote, "No Jew in our situation would ever have dreamed of going out with a suitcase full of clothing." Hers has the diary. She spent 2 years in hiding before being discovered. Her diary contains details of her chores, her studies, personal reflections on her maturing body and her emotions and her hopes for the future. She wanted to become a writer. Unfortunately, she didn't live long enough, but her diary did become famous, and even today it speaks for the millions of Jews who were caught in the Holocaust. I have some pictures of the diary. She called her diary her intimate friend. You see, she pasted sometimes photographs in there. She wrote in one entry, she's talking to her diary. She says, "I hope I will be able to confide everything to you." She wrote about her friends who were being transported, scares when burglars broke into the house. She wrote of meals, her studies, her awakening sexuality, her arguments with her mother. There are some entries that are erased. And in August of 1944, the diaries stop. 3 days later, they are discovered by the Gestapo and deported. She died of typhus in Bergen-Belsen just a few weeks before the camps were liberated. Her father, the family's sole survivor, published the diary, and as of this date, it has sold over 20 million copies. Next diarist, Sylvia Plath. She began a diary at the age of 11. She was a typical teenager, but she suffered outbreaks of depression and rage. In Cambridge in 1956, she met and married the British poet Ted Hughes. She wrote in her diary, "I married a real poet and my life is redeemed." When she discovered his infidelity, she committed suicide. She kept diaries in the last 3 years of her life. The last diary, the one covering the period just before her suicide, was destroyed by Hughes after her death. We can take a look at the diary. She wrote in it of her marital love for Hughes, quote, "I need Ted to kiss me and smell me and sleep with me and read with me as much as I need bread and wine." When she discovered he was having an affair, she wrote, "It is as if my life were magically run by two electric currents. One was joyous and positive, the other despairing and negative." This is, of course, Sylvia Plath. She's going to be my last diarist. All of these many diaries show us people's instinct to document their lives, no matter how painful. They are among our greatest historical treasures. I think they're even more important nowadays where we don't have letters. We often have, Dickens, I think there's 32 volumes of his letters. But people write on email now, and those things are not maintained in the same way. So diaries are very important. They bring a place, a person, a world to life. They're invaluable for the historian and for the literature student. I'm going to end with a photograph of some of my own diaries, which I confess I am a diarist. And this is the corner of my room you don't see behind me. And you'll see I have the years on all of them. I have quite a few shelves of them. And I used to have the practice each New Year's Day, I would read my diary of the previous year to my husband. I always pasted in tickets, calling cards, whatever paper records I could assemble. Yet I do remember my dear husband saying to me once, after I finished my reading, used to do it on New Year's Day, he said, "You seem never to record deeply personal thoughts." And I thought about that, and it's true. I didn't. I didn't. I don't, although I'm a diarist, I suppose I have kept my deepest secrets to myself. Now that my husband is gone, I write much less in my diaries. I suppose that's because I live much less, at least in my outer life. One of the things that's happened to me is I've started to write poetry. And I find that I do confess some of my secrets to my poems. And I think they are kind of accompaniment to my more literal diaries. I've now written over 100 poems, and I've separated them into categories. One category is family, one is literature, one is music, and one is loneliness. I suppose my categories tell the story of my life, perhaps even more than my diaries. So I'm going to end on that note, and it gives us about 10 minutes to talk and to answer questions, which I would be happy to do. All right.
Oh, thank you so much, Helen. So we are going to go ahead and take questions from both folks here in the room and then also on Zoom. So folks on Zoom, if you would do me the favor of raising your hand before you speak so that we can just make sure that we're not talking over each other, and we'll just try to alternate between those of us who are here in the room and those of us who are online. I saw Janet, your hand go up. Feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Unmute yourself.
Thank you.
Okay.
I don't know about being a great diarist, but as far as diaries go, I just wanted to tell Helen that Patsy sends her best.
Okay.
Any questions from folks here in the room?
Well, I think you see there's a lot of different purposes to keeping a diary, you know. And some people, like the Tolstoys, they were able to put their deepest thoughts into those diaries, which is okay. But in reading them to the other person, it created some tension between them as they began to have different thoughts about life and what life's all about and what they wanted to do. So there's a danger in showing your diary to someone else, I think. But we've seen people use it, you know, as a kind of a sort of a ground for writing fiction, you know, get the places and the smell of a place, the look of a place, what someone says, get it written down, and you can use it for fiction. Some people, perhaps someone like Samuel Pepys, went out to watch the fire of London and put it all in his book. In his diary, he had some idea that he was living through something. You know, I lived through 9/11. I was sitting in my office at Framingham State. We were having a meeting when my then vice president said, can I go and get the little television set I have? He said, because something's happened in New York, and there's a plane flew into one of the buildings of in the Trade Center. And I said, sure. And I actually saw the second plane go in and strike the second building. And I didn't write that down. I didn't put any of that in. So I'm probably not a good historical diarist, you know. I would put down more things about my children and what they did, or what, even that, I wouldn't put down some things about my children, because after I'm gone, they might read it. They might not like it. So you have to be ready for the repercussions of someone else reading your diary.
We have a question in the chat. Could you comment on the Goncourt journals?
The Goncourt, the French, I haven't read them. I know they're translated now, but I haven't. Would that person like to make a comment on them? I know they exist. I'm very much stuck in the world of English-speaking diarists.
While that person is thinking about it, I also had a question for you, Helen, just sort of based on what you were talking about in terms of other people reading your diaries. Do you think that the notion of recording one's life to such an honest extent was represented in the diary, or do you think the knowledge that some people were reading their diary limited some of the honesty that they might have shared?
Well, I do think those early diaries, those 17th and 18th century diaries, Samuel Pepys and James Boswell, I mean, the recording of their sexual peccadillos and adventures, you know, to me, that's extraordinary that a man, particularly men, would write that down exactly, you know, what he did to encourage this woman to go to bed with him, how he was thinking of it in church. I find that remarkable. I don't have an example of women recording that kind of thing. I don't know. I'm sure some did, but I found that very remarkable, really. Whereas other people like Dorothy Wordsworth, she was mainly interested in writing down the things she saw when she walked with her brother. But she did write down about wearing that wedding ring on the night before he married, and somebody else crossed it out. This is something that shouldn't have been told, because it suggests an almost incestuous kind of feeling that she had for her brother. Maybe she did. Who knows? There's nothing else in her diaries. They are published and I've read them. But that particular thing was in. So it's dangerous. It's dangerous. It's like, you know, Catholic people used to have made great use of confessionals. And they would confess things. And of course, the priest had the seal of the confession. You cannot tell anybody what this person told me in the confessional. And in a sense, to me, that was an image of the way some people looked at the diary, that it was a confession, and that the diary itself would not tell its secrets. I don't know, by the time you get to people like Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, the fact that he destroyed the journal before before her suicide indicates that he could not let the world see what she was writing and how she was feeling, that it was too much to reveal that.
We've got a raised hand online and in the room. So Judy, go ahead, and then we'll do the question in the room.
Okay.
Hi, so this isn't so much about a diary, but many years ago when my mom died, I received one of the greatest gifts I think I've ever had in my life, which was a shoebox from a friend of hers filled with all kinds of cards, letters, postcards that she had saved, for like 25 years. And reading those gave me such an insight into my mom, things that she, would never tell me or tell my brothers. So I just wanted to share that it was, kind of unlike today with emails and texts that sort of disappear into the ether. Not only had my mom written all these things, but that her friend had saved them and then shared them with me, which was just a beautiful gift.
You don't know why she gave that box of things to the friend as opposed to giving it to you.
No, her friend gave them to me. My
Yeah.
mom had written them all these years, so it was one side of
I
a
see.
correspondence between the two of them.
I
But
see.
it was just beautiful because the friend had saved all these things. And then, like I say, when my mom died, she mailed me this, shoebox filled with, like I say, it was about 25 years of, Christmas cards and birthday cards and just general letters and postcards from vacations,
So,
and, shared things about myself and my two brothers, about what she was feeling and what we were all doing. It was really just a beautiful insight into what my mom was thinking.
so the shoebox became the diary. The
Sort of.
friends
Yeah.
saved what could have been put into a diary. You could use it if you're inclined that way to shape it into a picture of your mother. I have one thing. My mother wrote an awful lot of letters. She wrote to me after I got married and moved away. She wrote constantly, and she wrote. But the other letters I have from my mother are during the war. I had two brothers in World War II, and my mother and my father did not write the letters. In fact, they were his children. My father was a widower with 3 children when he married my mother. So, but my mother writes the letters to, particularly to Richard, and he saved them, and I have them. They're not, it gives me just that little insight into the fact that even though this wasn't her biological son, she was very, very devoted to him and wrote these letters. And of course, her letters to me. So the letters become a form of diary, don't they? Cards, they're a form of diary keeping. Yes, it's very good. Yes, somebody else had something.
Yes, there was a question in the room. Go ahead. And I'll repeat it for you, Helen, because I think you're a little far away.
So
Okay, please.
this is a personal question for Helen, and it's regarding the transition from writing her diary with the expectation that her husband might read them to when they became more of a free flow expression. And the question is, during that transition, what can you say the difference was, both in changes in your physical health or emotional health, spiritual health, as well as any changes in the writing? Did the writing evolve once it was more expressive, or once it was more unlimited and free?
Did you need me to repeat that, Helen, or did you get it?
I'd like you to repeat it. Yes, I didn't hear
Sure.
it.
He's asking a personal question. He's wondering about the transition between when you knew that your husband would be reading the diary versus when you knew it was more of a free flowing form of expression in terms of your emotional and your your mental health when you were putting words on the page, and then also if there was a difference and a change in the writing in between the before and the after of the diaries.
That's a very good question. You know, I didn't always do that. So that's good. I'd have to remember when was the time, and it would have been after the children were grown and married and out, that we were alone on New Year's Day. And I got that idea of, why don't I read you the diary of the year? And, you know, so we can see what we did this year. I didn't do that in our early years. No, and so I'd have to go back and see whether I was more frank before I started knowing I was going to read it aloud to my husband. Yes. That's a good question that I can't answer, but it's a very good question. If you know you're going to publish this diary, if you know it's going to be read by somebody else, does it change the nature of the diary itself? Because you know there's going to be someone else who's reading it, and it's less your personal thoughts. Yes, it's a good question. I can't answer it, but it's a good question to think about.
Did you find that the nature of the diary evolved after your husband had passed and you continued to write more for yourself once again?
I found that I wrote less, and after I started taking Alan Feldman's poetry seminar, I started to be able to write down my feelings of loneliness and loss, which I know is not in the diaries that I keep even now. An awful lot in the diary is what I'm reading, what I saw on television, where I went, when the children invited me to do this or that. It's very, very factual. But I think poetry is a form, for me, I think that everyone who writes puts something of himself or herself into it, whether you're writing a letter, whether you're writing a diary, even if you're writing fiction. I've had people say to me, some people who know me very well, as you know, I've written this book, which is a continuation of Jane Austen's Emma, called Emma Redux. There were 4 of them actually, but in the first one, I had a friend of mine, a very close friend, actually a colleague from Framingham State, Elaine Beelan, a wonderful teacher in the English department there. When she read the book, she said, she said, as you write about the marriage of Emma and Mr. Knightley, which isn't in Jane Austen. I mean, Jane Austen ends it with their marriage. That's the end of it. We never see them as married in Jane Austen. They go on their honeymoon. They're gone. And what I did was I took them along. I imagined what their honeymoon was like and where they went and the children they had and what they did and so forth. And this friend of mine said, she said, it isn't just Emma and Mr. Knightley, it's you and John. So I do think that fiction writers also, you can find out a lot about D.H. Lawrence through reading his novels. You can find out a lot about his relationship with his wife. And I think you can learn a lot about Dickens by reading, even though Dickens gives us these people that you think they're eccentrics and they're so different, but wait a minute, you can learn about him and his life. So I think everyone who writes, whether you're writing fiction, whether you're writing biography, whether you're writing letters, whether you're writing diaries, you're putting parts of yourself in there. And for me, writing poetry has been my way of writing about feelings that I have, and I can put them out that way, but I do think anytime you put the pen to paper and you write something, like the person who talked about the shoebox, your mother was writing letters to this person, and yet what comes out of it is what she is like. So it's a very interesting study. Thank you for that question.
We got time for one more question, and I saw a hand go up over here. Nope, not anymore.
Chris Doyle had a question on the chat.
I've seen a couple comments. I don't know if
Nancy Grossman has a question.
Okay.
Yes, I'm just curious to know, Doctor, what you intend to have become of your diaries when you pass on? Not
Well,
harming you.
That's a good question. I have said to one of my daughters-in-law, I have 4 sons, so you really need to tell this to woman. And one of my daughters-in-law has said, I will take care of your diaries and albums. I mean, I not only have these, I don't know, 100 diaries here, I have all these albums in another room, because before that I used to put albums together about the family and the pictures, mainly pictures, but I would write things in. She said, I will take care of them. So I trust her. I hope they won't be thrown on the dust heap, but it would take a lot of time for somebody to sit down and read all of these. But as long as they're preserved, I think that's the only thing that I think will happen. I think my daughter-in-law, Wendy, has said she would see to it that these things are kept. You can't, there's a wonderful part in George Eliot's Middlemarch. Dorothea makes what is a really bad marriage to this man, Casaubon, and it's a mistake. And one of the things he realizes is that I think it's his cousin, is attracted to her, and he knows he's going to die, Casaubon. And he decides to put into his will that if she marries Will Ladislaw, she's not going to get his money. And the name of that whole section of Middlemarch is called The Dead Hand. And I think, we can't have a dead hand. We might try to say, please preserve this or whatever, but you can't do it from the grave. You just hope. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Heineman. As always, a fascinating and insightful talk about present and past authors. Thank you all so much for joining us here in the room. Thank you for joining us online. I know we've got some folks on YouTube, so thank you for finding your way to us by any media that worked best for you. We hope that you'll join us next week on November 9th. We will be having Pam Seabour Cable come in and talk about textiles as storytellers, from the Bayou Tapestry to Bisa Butler. So we hope that you will join us 7 p.m. either in person here in the Costin Room or live on YouTube Live. Helen, I'm glad you mentioned your book, because we are very excited to have Helen come back twice in December, once on Zoom and once in person only. In person only at the McAuliffe Library on December 5th. She will be doing an author talk and discussing her book, Emma Redux, with us. Copies are available for sale and signed. So we hope you'll join us at the McAuliffe branch then. And then I don't have the date off the top of my head. Helen, is it the 14th or the 19th?
It's the 18th.
The 18th, I was right in the middle. The 18th, Helen will be doing her annual Christmas Carol read. It's an abridged version with over 200 illustrations. So that will be on Zoom. So keep an eye on our website and our registration page to register for that as well. And thank you again so much for joining us tonight.
No, Laura, what you just said about the next lecture next week, even textiles tell a story.
Yes.
Even doing embroidery, one of my students does the most wonderful cross stitch, and you can go to her house and see these things on her wall, and they tell a story. So everything you do tells a story one way or another. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Great way to end. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.